On 26th June 1565, on a narrow, rocky tongue of land at the entrance to Malta's harbour, where Fort Saint Elmo still stood in the morning, there is now a smoking heap of stone soaked in blood. A few hundred knights, Spanish arquebusiers, and Maltese defenders hold out to the last while around them boils a sea of tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers. By evening, the Turks finally break through, slaughter every defender, and only then realize the price of this victory. Under the walls of this tiny fort lie thousands of their own dead, including roughly half of their elite Janissaries. The next day, the waves carry a horrific message to the other fortresses: the bodies of decapitated knights nailed to crosses. In reply, Jean Parisot de Valette orders the heads of all Turkish prisoners cut off and sent back, packed into cannonballs and fired into the Ottoman camp. This is not just an exchange of cruelty. It is a declaration. This small, rocky island intends to stand to the end, even if the entire Mediterranean cracks beneath it. By the end of this story, you will see how one rock with monks on it breaks the myth of the invincible Ottoman war machine. But to understand why everything breaks exactly here, we need to rewind a bit. The Maltese Hospitallers are the remnants of the Knights of Rhodes, driven out of that island in 1522 by these same Ottomans. Their new capital is a bare, wind-swept island in the center of the Mediterranean, given to them by Emperor Charles V, almost as compensation, with a bitter bonus: the obligation to hold back the Turks and Barbary corsairs, to stand like a living shield between Istanbul and the coasts of Spain. Meanwhile, the Turks are turning the sea into their personal highway. After the fall of Rhodes come raids by Barbary pirates, burned-out towns on the coasts of Spain and Italy, tens of thousands of captives chained to oars on galleys. In 1551, that same Dragut, Turgut Reis, already appears off Malta, devastates nearby Gozo, and carries off almost the entire island population into slavery. 9 years later, off Djerba, the Ottoman fleet smashes a united Christian squadron. About half the Christian ships are sunk or captured, and the Mediterranean begins to look like a Turkish lake. In this picture, Malta is not a resort paradise, but a concrete brick sticking out in the path of an imperial wave. The island is poor, fresh water is scarce, there are almost no forests. But it lies exactly between Istanbul, Tunis, and Sicily. For the Ottomans, it is a convenient springboard for strikes on Sicily and Naples. For the Spanish and the Knights, it is a 16th century aircraft carrier from which it is convenient to hunt Ottoman ships. And the Knights hunt so aggressively that in 1564 they even seize a ship linked to the highest circles of the Sultan's court, with important prisoners aboard. In Istanbul, this is taken as a personal insult. The central figure of the defense is Jean Parisot de Valette, a French nobleman who has survived the siege of Rhodes and dozens of naval campaigns. He is in his 60s, covered in scars, with experience and an iron character. In 1557, he is elected Grand Master, and unlike romantic storybook knights, Valette understands perfectly that war is not only about honor, but also about logistics. He builds a network of spies in Constantinople, strengthens old strongholds and lays out new ones, turning Malta into a stony hedgehog of bastions. The defenders' main imba, their broken, overpowered advantage, is not noble cloaks with crosses, but stone and geometry. In the narrow harbour stand 3 key teeth: the old Fort St. Angelo at Birgu, the new Fort St. Michael on the Senglea Peninsula, and the small but critically important Fort Saint Elmo at the tip of Mount Siberus, which controls the entrance to the harbour. All of them are low, thick-walled forts designed for artillery, not tall medieval towers. Inside the walls are guns that can shower siege towers and tight infantry columns with chain shot. This is not a knightly castle, it is a proto-star fortification. The second cheat is preparation. After hearing from his spies that a huge fleet is already forming in Constantinople, Valette starts doing things any romantic chronicler would brand dishonorable. He orders the entire harvest on the island cut in advance, even unripe grain, so that the Ottomans will have no local food. The wells are poisoned with bitter herbs and dead animals. Peasants and townsfolk are herded behind the walls of fortified towns. The fortresses are packed with gunpowder, water, and hardtack. This is not a nightly duel. It is the deliberate turning of the whole island into a trap where time itself works against the Ottomans. Now look at the opposite side. Suleiman the Magnificent, an aging but still dangerous predator, sends to Malta what may be one of the largest armadas of the 16th century, about 180-190 ships, and, by various estimates, from 25,000 to 40,000 soldiers, including elite Janissaries and Sipahis. He splits command between the land commander Mustafa Pasha, the Admiral Piyale Pasha, and the legendary corsair Dragut, who is in theory supposed to obey both of them. On paper, this looks like an all-star team. In reality, it is a recipe for conflicts, delays, and strategic blunders. On 18th of May 1565, the Turkish fleet appears off Malta. From the shore, knights and peasants see what looks like a wall of sails from horizon to horizon. The first skirmishes flare up the very next day, but the most interesting events take place in the command tent. Piyale wants to bring the fleet into the convenient Marsamxet harbour north of the main port, but first the small Fort Saint Elmo, which controls the entrance, must be taken. Mustafa, on the contrary, proposes striking the weakly defended inland capital Medina and then attacking the main forts from the landward side, ignoring Elmo. In the end, they decide to quickly demolish Elmo in a few days, and only then move on. Those few days will cost the Ottomans a whole month of blood. While the Turks set up camp and drag heavy cannon onto the heights of Mount Siberus, Valette behaves as if he has an inexhaustible supply of men, though in reality he has only about 600 knights, and in total around 6,000 defenders, including Maltese militia, mercenaries, and even galley rowers. He sends his best to Elmo: Spanish veterans of the Sicilian Tercio, some knights, and professional gunners. He needs not just a fort, he needs a grinding whetstone on which the sharp edge of the Ottoman army will be worn down. Imagine you are one of these Spanish soldiers in Elmo. The fort is small and lies lower than the Turkish batteries. From 27th May, more than 36 heavy guns pound you every day. By some estimates, tens of thousands of cannonballs over several weeks. The walls crumble into dust. The embrasures turn into raw wounds. At night, when the Turks think you are about to surrender, boats slip across the strait in the dark with reinforcements and supplies. The wounded are evacuated. Fresh men are brought in. By day, you stand knee-deep in rubble and corpses. By night, you listen as the oarsmen carry new, doomed comrades to their positions. In early June, Dragut arrives to join the Ottomans, a man whom even European admirals call a living map of the Mediterranean. According to the sources, he scolds Mustafa for not taking Medina first and for leaving the interior of the island unconquered. He orders the crossing to Elmo cut, sets up new batteries that fire across the narrow channel between Elmo and Angelo, and turns the siege into a professional operation. But fate loves irony. On 18th of June, near one of these batteries, a cannonball explodes, and a splinter of stone or their own parapet slams into his head. A few days later, the legendary corsair dies, and with him the only person in the Ottoman camp who truly understands how to work with sea and time here. From 16 to 23rd of June, the final meat grinder for Elmo begins. Janissaries storm the ruined walls again and again, the Turks seize the ravelin and the ditch, and the fighting takes place literally chest-deep in brick dust. Finally, on 23rd of June, the remnants of the garrison, about 1,500 men, are crushed. Modern estimates say the Ottomans pay for this tiny fort with at least 6,000 dead, including half of all their Janissaries. The fleet, for whose sake all this began, does indeed get a safe harbour. But the army already looks as if it has passed through a shredder, and above all, a month of the campaign and much of its fighting spirit have been lost. The symbolism of cruelty after Elmo's fall flies up to full medieval horror level. Mustafa orders the knights' bodies beheaded and sent floating on crosses. an obvious message. This is what will happen to all defenders. Valette responds in mirror fashion. Turkish prisoners are sent to the next world. Their heads fly into the Ottoman camp as bizarre cannonballs. This is not barbarism on one side and civilization on the other. It is an honest portrait of a 16th century religious war where both sides see in the enemy not just opponents, but a threat to their entire faith and world. While guns thunder around Malta, another sound spreads across Europe: panic. Spanish and Italian cities realize that if Malta falls, the next blow could come against Sicily or Naples. Queen Elizabeth of England writes openly that the fall of the island will open the door to further dangers for the rest of Christendom. And that is no exaggeration of the mood of the age. In the eyes of contemporaries, Malta is the last cork in a bottle full of Ottoman gunpowder. Later historians will cool the emotions and say, yes, the siege was important, but it was more a sign of overstretched Ottoman expansion than a moment when Europe was literally on the brink of immediate conquest. Meanwhile, after Elmo, the Turks switched to the main prize, the peninsulas of Birgu and Senglea, where the core of the defense is concentrated. They surround the fortifications with a ring of about 65 heavy guns, and what chroniclers call one of the most intense bombardments of the era begins. Some sources speak of up to 130,000 cannonballs fired during the whole siege. The town is turned into dust and splinters. People live for weeks under fire, getting used to falling asleep to the crash of guns like other people fall asleep to thunder. On 15th of July, Mustafa decides to play it beautifully, a double strike on Senglea. By land, corsairs assault Fort St. Michael, and by sea 1,000 Janissaries in about 100 small boats hauled over the isthmus are to land from the rear, inside the protected harbour, bypassing the main Maltese guns. On paper, the plan is clever. Cut Senglea off from the sea and crush it in a pincer. But a deserter warns Valette in advance, and he hastily orders a palisade built across the neck of land. The key move, however, is made not by the council but by an engineer. At the foot of St. Angelo, a low battery of 5 guns has been prepared specifically for attempts like this. When the Ottoman boats enter the kill zone, 2 salvos turn them into splinters. Modern estimates say more than 800 attackers die there. Imagine you are sitting in one of these boats. Dark water around you, oars beating in rhythm, the wall of Senglea ahead, and behind you the confident roar of drums. Suddenly a mouth opens in front of you, a low gun platform almost at water level. The first volley wipes out half the flotilla, the second finishes off what is still afloat. From the shore you can't see details, only boards and bodies turned into pulp. Those who survive and scramble onto the rocks no longer look like conquerors of Europe, but like men brought straight to slaughter. But even after this failed attempt, Mustafa does not give up. On 7th of August, he stages another Day X, a massive attack on both Senglea and Birgu at once. By then, the bastions are already partially ruined, the defenders are weakening, and the powder is running low. At one point, the Turks truly break into the breach, and it seems that everything is over. And here the factor of chance plus psychology kicks in. A cavalry detachment from Mdina under Vincenzo Anastasi makes a sortie, and, along the way, smashes the Turkish field hospital, beheading dozens of wounded. The Turks take this as a sign that a large Spanish army has arrived from the north, and at the most favourable moment for them, instead of finishing off the defenders, they begin to pull back. The second half of August is no longer about heroic gestures, but about a sticky struggle on the edge of collapse. At one point, Valette's council seriously discusses abandoning the ruined town and retreating into the better protected Fort Saint Angelo. The Grand Master flatly forbids it. He understands that once the knights start retreating, panic will devour the garrison faster than Turkish cannonballs. At the same time, the Turks use everything left in their arsenal, from the manta, a small siege roof covered with shields, to a large siege tower at St. Michael. Both times Maltese engineers dig tunnels toward these machines and pour chain shot into them at point-blank range, turning expensive structures into piles of wood and bones. When it seems that everyone's strength is exhausted, a game of nerves begins. In early September, Mustafa tries to carry out a late plan: march the army on Mdina, occupy it, and winter there. But the defenders of Mdina, although the town is in fact weak and poorly supplied, decide to play on psychology. They start firing their cannons at absurdly long range, spending their precious shot almost into empty space. For the Turks, by now completely drained and paranoid, this looks like a sign. These people have endless ammunition. The attack never really begins, and the army in the end folds back towards the shore. The final act is called in Italian Gran Soccorso, the Great Relief. On 7 September, about 8,000 soldiers from the Spanish Empire and various Italian states land in the northern part of the island. They occupy a favorable ridge and form up, preparing to strike at the demoralized Ottomans. Mustafa, at first thinking that he faces a huge army, begins loading his troops onto the ships, then, realizing that he still outnumbers the enemy, drives them ashore again. A series of battles follows. In one of them, according to the chroniclers, some knights simply cannot bear the sight of retreating Turks and charge without orders, turning the fight into a general assault. The Ottoman army breaks, abandons its heavy equipment, and in the middle of September leaves the island. What is left on the island after the departure of an army comparable to a small city? By different estimates, the Ottomans lose from 25,000 to 35,000 men to combat and disease. The defenders lose at least 2,500, and the order itself up to a third of its knights. Malta loses about a third of its population, and Birgu and Senglea are almost leveled with the ground. The earth around the fortresses is a layer of rubble and decomposing bodies. Birds, rats, problems with burials, and outbreaks of disease become part of the post-battle reality, no less than diplomatic letters. For Europe, this story almost instantly turns into legend. In the 16th century, people write about it, preach about it from pulpits, engrave it on prints. Later, Voltaire will toss off a line that nothing is better known than the Siege of Malta. And that is not just rhetoric, but a reflection of how deeply this episode cut into the collective memory. Grand Master Jean de Valette becomes a living symbol of the knight who did not retreat a single step. In gratitude, money flows into the order from all over Europe, and on the slope of Mount Siberas they lay out a new city, Valette, built as one giant fortress so that no one can ever again sit there in camp and bombard the old forts from above. From a military point of view, the Siege of Malta is not the end of the world for the Ottomans. They are still strong at sea, their fleet still dominates, and 6 years later both sides will clash again in another gigantic bloodbath at Lepanto. Some modern historians believe that even if Malta had fallen, Spain would eventually have recaptured it. But the psychological effect is different. For the first time in a long while, a huge Ottoman army bearing the symbols of the victor leaves with nothing, having lost, by estimates, about a third of its strength and its best admiral. The aura of complete invincibility develops a crack. For Malta and the Order, this is also a turning point. On the one hand, the island becomes a symbol of the shield of Christendom, the last epic battle with Crusader knights in white cloaks taking part. On the other hand, the knights' lives remain far from saintly. They continue to raid, to keep slaves, to play the role of a half-state, half-pirate corporation. In Turkish memory, Dragut remains a heroic naval genius. Cities and ships in his homeland bear his name. On Malta, he is perceived almost as a demonic enemy who fell at the walls he never managed to break. Historians still argue today. Was the Great Siege of Malta really the battle that saved Europe, or just a spectacular episode in a long chain of Ottoman-Habsburg confrontations? But if you look at the actual stones and bones, the picture is simple. Disciplined infantry in well-designed forts, smart logistics, and the factor of time can grind down any numerical imba. especially when the enemy arrives with divided command and a firm belief that these monks with crosses will fall in a couple of days. The moral here is not about holiness or civilizations, but about arrogance. The Ottoman army comes to a small island as if to an easy training exercise and leaves it, having left tens of thousands of bodies behind and a crack in its own myth. Malta, by contrast, enters history not as a romantic bastion, but as an example that sometimes the most reliable sword is boring, rational preparation. Scorched fields, poisoned wells, and a stubborn old man who, at the hardest moment, simply tells his people, "We are not retreating." Empires do not collapse because of curses. They collapse because they overestimate themselves and underestimate somebody else's rocks.